I'm the only person on all of YouTube to ever make a video like this, 100 late game tips and tricks. Not only have I been coached by a bunch of different pros and a bunch of different coaches, but also my placements have gotten a lot better since I actually started to remember some of these things that I'm going to teach you in the game. Rotating, refreshes, tarping, controlling a layer, anything to do with late game, I'm going to give you all the knowledge that I know so that you can start to learn how to get better at it yourself. The only thing that I ask is that when you're in the item shop, make sure you plug in code KenBeans. I'm pretty sure this is the 10th or 1100 tip video on my channel, so that means we're breaking the 1000 mark. Strap in, we got a long video, and let's start out with tip number 1, the most beginner tip I can give. Beginner players, I would say the number 1 most common thing is they don't even realize how to identify the final closing zone. That little tiny dot on the mini map is where it's pulling. It kind of flashes. It doesn't look like any of the other zones. The more you try and find it and see it as you're playing, it's going to be easier to identify it the next time. Number 2 is something that people struggle with, some more than others. If you find yourself tarping in the wrong direction of the zone, which is a pretty common thing, do one of 2 things. You can look at the arrow of your player on the mini map in relation to where the zone is going, and then you can try and get in the zone that way. Or sometimes what Jiven told me to do, which kind of works, is you can literally look at the edges of the zone, like in the game itself, not on the mini map. You look at like the blue area and see where the zone is moving. That will tell you the direction you need to go into so that you don't get lost. Sometimes that's what I do, and I don't even bother looking at the map. Always make sure you're aware of the dead side. The dead side of the zone is where the least amount of players are, and that's the spot that you have to be the most aware of in an endgame. Typically, this is the most ideal side to be on because it allows you to have a freer rotate. And usually it's going to be on the left or right side. It's never going to be in the center of the zone. That's almost impossible. What helps me a lot is I take like 2 seconds when the new zone appears, I mark it on the mini map. So in the moving zones, I'll be able to visually see where I need to end up. Going off the last tip, like I said, when I mark it, I look at the terrain too, so I can see if there's any mountains, ravines, any big sort of elevation changes. These are the things I look for so I can develop a plan in the moment. This is something that's not usually picked up on by the normal eye. In a late game situation, you want to keep in mind that the line of sight that height has on you. So if I know I'm second height, you see how here I ran in the center where height can see me? What I should have done is hug the side of the wall as I'm trying to drop down in layers so that height can't shoot me. Even moving over half a box to the left is going to make it so that I won't get shot and take damage as I'm dropping, compared to just running directly in the center where I'll probably get shot. When you're on height, you can look to make the L shape with your builds like this so that you have easy access to look back on the edge of zone. Pro players and non-pro players, they do this all the time so that way it's a super easy way to shoot people. To be honest, it's almost necessary when you play height. Any rotate that you're going to make, it starts either the second the zone closes or when the next zone appears. When you're trying to make your way into the end game, you're either going early or you're going late. There's no in between waiting 30 seconds and then going. That's the general rule of thumb. If you're rotating in a place like this where you're on the dead side of zone, just make sure you're fully aware of your surroundings because most of the time you're only going to have to block one side as you're rotating. Before you fully commit, just make sure you're aware of your angles. If you're moving in the zones and you're looking to make a rotate, you should build wood at the start and then finish with hard mats. It doesn't make any sense to have all your hard mats in the zone and then you are left in weak builds at the front. This is something that a pro named Cease taught me, and it's something that I use when I'm rotating and I see a lot of people boxed up around me. Let's take this hill for example. So as I'm trying to get into the zone, I have my pump out and there's a bunch of builds around me. Anyone that opens up is going to get a shut up shot. So it pretty much tells them to, when they open, they get shot and then they reset really quick, like they don't want to take damage. This is in hopes that you'll be able to get in without them spraying you, and then that way they'll reset their builds. You kind of need a fast sense and you need to look all around you really quick so that anyone who opens is just like a quick snap, like in Kovacs. Whenever you're landing off a pad, impulse, shockwaves, whatever it is, you can slide across the builds with your momentum and then just get really deep into the zone. Jiven is really good at doing this. He goes up, straight across. He's just super smooth with it. If you're on the dead side of zone and you start getting sprayed at, a lot of people are going to be looking at you, and since you're the only one there, you're going to be the only focus. Switch to hard mats and try and build yourself in. Never keep building wood when you're constantly getting sprayed at. It's a big mistake. Simply put, when you're landing in an endgame, you can land off someone's tarp and just create a simple box like this, or you could even connect yourself landing below them if you think that that layer would be more free. It's not always as concrete as you might think. You can create your own space. So sometimes in like a half and half zone, you're going to get sprayed at harder and harder until more people join in. To be super safe, don't be afraid to invest a lot of mats like Muzz. You see how he creates this kind of tarp and he's blocking a lot of angles, making it really hard for third parties to continue spraying. It discourages other people from joining in, but sometimes it's kind of just unavoidable, like this guy. Whenever you go through someone's tarp or or you're just ratting through some old builds, always keep your pump out and ready to shoot. Sounds pretty self-explanatory, but taking out your pickaxe, switch it to your SMG, just keep your pump out and be ready.
Just pickaxe. I guess hold your pump.
If you died with mats in any one of your games, then you did it wrong. Use everything before you let someone get a free elim. Even if it means that you're gonna go into the first moving zone really shambles, it's better than trying to be greedy and dying. That's something that I still need to work on every now and then. I'll die in late game with tons of mats when I could have just used it to fully tarp in. If chili splash or peppers are in the game, they go in and out all the time. This is definitely one of the best items that you can hold in an end game. You can move so quickly across builds that people literally won't even have time to box you. Sometimes they could be even more worth than a pet. Here's a big tip. As your builds are finishing, I look around and kind of through them so I can see where players are in relation to me. I feel like a lot of players are only looking in one direction as this is happening. I look up, down, left, and right. Anytime you're in some sort of end game moving zone, the best thing you can do for yourself is to sprint to things that are farmable. Sometimes instead of focusing on a kill, I'll sprint to a rock or something and look for the mat refresh. Anytime you build a tarp in wood, I always like to double my tops and my bottoms, even if I don't have that many mats. It just makes it harder for someone to spray into your face. People are more likely to shoot at you when they know you're only separated by one wood wall. In general, anytime you have a tarp made, always try to close the edits behind you. That way, if someone breaks in, they can't get a sneak one pump on you. But if I have a full tarp, I'll even reset cones, turn it into stairs, make it hard for people to get in. Not every time you get a kill, you gotta grab the refresh. Sometimes you gotta let it go because going for it will be more of a risk than actually getting those mats. Putting yourself in a real bad spot with mats is sometimes worse than being in a good spot with no mats. This is a secret pro tip. If you have a lot of spare white, sometimes what you could do is tank the zone to cut off people on the front side. So going all the way in zone to grab low ground like this is literally the easiest way to get it. Anytime I'm in one box and I see a stair in front of my box, without question, I'll always just edit the cone in the direction of where that stair is. I'm like kind of sort of anticipating someone jumping in. Most of the time, that's what happens. Anytime you have a box above someone and you're only connected by one wall, you can edit the floor and look down and place a wall from above like this. Never in my life do I try to stay in an end game and only be connected by one build because people will just grief no matter what. If you need to make a rotate, you see that someone kind of rotated already along the dead side of the zone. Use their builds, kind of follow and snake your way in so that you can kind of use that same rotate, but you don't have to invest as much mats. If someone's behind you or there's someone in front of you as you're rotating along the dead side, it's typically better to avoid fighting. Fighting on the dead side of zone can get you lobby focused real quick. Kind of think of it like good karma. I don't shoot you, you don't shoot me, we both get in and we can make it. If you need a refresh, that's a different story, but generally that's how it works. If you find yourself being trailed by someone else while you're trying to make a rotate, always be sure to kind of block your back every now and then. Occasionally blocking off your back helps you not get beamed by other players rotating behind you. So you don't want to fight on the dead side, you don't really want to cause too much beef, so that means that you're going to try to never stop and just delay yourself for some reason. Think about rotating like a conveyor belt. It constantly keeps moving, but if one thing slacks, then it delays everyone else behind you and it's going to screw up the rotate. Always try and keep it moving. You're low on mats, you're in the end game. In general, a refresh will come if you have around 300 mats. You can make it very far in a late game with around that much mats. You might not think that's what it's like, especially if you're a beginner, but a lot of pros will feel very comfortable in the late zones with 300 mats full tarping. Chances are you're definitely going to have a lot more mats than the people around you. This is the biggest IQ endgame tip I've ever seen. Jiven here had low mats and he saw this loot in the river. Instead of going for the mats because he had none, he uses it like a bait to shoot this guy who's also going for it and then uses those mats to win the game. Something I was taught is that you should always be trying to play a game of attrition with the people on height because that's like the win condition. So pretty much what I mean by that is I look to grief them in any spot or situation I'm in. So let's just say before I make a rotate, I'm spraying at height and then I'll just go front side of zone. And then I won't take it now, but I'll take it later when they have less mats, and I'll constantly keep doing that. That way, by the time I actually go to take it, they have nothing and just give it up real easy. Compared to if I just didn't do anything and then I take it at a random time, they're going to be a lot more stacked and it's going to be harder. If you notice height is tarping ahead and they don't really have eyes on you, what you can do is kind of sneak up, gain height, spray them from the back and kind of push them down. It's unbelievable the amount of times you're going to see this in pro games where people will just sneak up on the back and then spray them down when they're already on top. Vice versa, if you see heights on the back backside of zone. What you can also do is if they're further enough away, you can kind of go to the front and then you can crank up from there because they have to rotate in that direction. But if you crank up from the front, you're going to be probably higher than them, or you at least have a good chance at contesting it. Kind of think of it like a little 1v1 because most of the time you're not going to get sprayed in the back from a different team while you're trying to crank on the height team. Always pressure second height when you're on height. This is the team who's right below you while you're on the high ground. You spray at them so you burn their mats and they don't crank up on you so that they know that someone's above them. Second height is typically your biggest threat because those are the people who are going to be trying to steal it from you since they're obviously so freaking close. If there's two separate teams on second height, I'm always going to try and spray both teams so that they know I'm above them, but I'm going to focus majority of my attention on the people in hard mats. Chances are they're going to be way more stacked, which is why I want to grief them. It's going to make the win easier later. When you're on height, always tarp in hard mats when you can. Me personally, I wouldn't try and save my hard mats for the final closing zones because at that point, no one's going to have hard mats anyway, so wood is going to be more than enough to get the job done. It's more of a threat when you lose height before you reach the final zone. So you got brick, you got metal, use it. Anytime you get a refresh in an end game, quickly create one extra box so that way you can grab the loot and be safe. If you're in a mad rush, just grab the loot, but most of the time I'll go back for the loot once I'm safe. When you see extra mats in zone and you want to go in for it, you should place just a couple builds even though it looks free. Chances are there's another person seeing the same thing. When you tarp on height with hard mats, for the most part, you can keep it to one layer. It's really kind of a up or down situation, but in general, I'm only really going to double my layers on height when I'm using wood. So when you're tarping on height and when there's like shockwaves or hammers, it doesn't necessarily apply the same way. What you want to do is you want to stay close enough to the builds where if you fall, you don't take a lot of fall damage. Generally speaking, you want to be at least 2 layers above height, 2 boxes above them, so that way they can't easily just get out their box, crank on you, and now they're above you. Nothing's more discouraging to someone when they're trying to take height, they look up at it and you're really high up. What players do all the time is they tarp ahead a little bit and then they let those builds finish and then they walk on them. You don't want to simply just be running on freshly built pieces all the time because it's the weakest builds, which is where you're most likely going to get shot out. So when you're tarping on height, you want to try to connect to other builds around you so that you can kind of reinforce your tarp. The more you're connected, the harder it's going to be to chop you down, no brainer. If the zone's pushing you forward and you don't have a plan, you can just use your mats and tarp out a few boxes to give yourself more time to think. If you're stressed and you don't know what to do, just tarp. If you look up at height and you notice they're only using wood, that's probably the most likely time you're going to be able to steal it from them. Chances are if you contest it, it might not even be a fight. They're just going to drop very easily. If you're second height and you're tarping, pay attention to height or people in general just being on top of your builds. They're looking to straight up just 50-50 you, no questions about it. Never panic when someone's sitting on top of your builds because that means they literally have nothing. It's free for you. The best thing to do in an endgame is to run up pre-edits. Even in solos, it's still one of the easiest ways to get kills. In my experience, in better lobbies, it's either run the pre-edit or get pre-edited. When you notice height is tunnel visioned on another player, you can practically sneak up right in front of them, like 1 box away from the back, and they'll have the slightest idea. Now, depending on how bad the players are, it's going to be easier, but the more you try it, the more you get comfortable with it, because at first it's going to be a little difficult. Don't be afraid to drop down on second height and try and go for a wall and grab a refresh, or maybe even go for a top. Especially when you know that you have the advantage, let's say you get some damage on them, it's definitely a time where you probably want to go for a refresh. Your best chance at grabbing some mats is going to be on second height. Change layers frequently while tarping or running on the mid ground. This makes you harder to track, therefore harder to kill, and you'll see players all the time build a couple builds up and then they'll go down and then they'll go up again. It's a super good way to not let other players track you. Almost any rotate, you want to avoid the middle of the zone. Try to always put yourself on the side, left or right of a zone. The center is where you're going to have the most threats around you from either direction, and it's going to be the place where you're going to have to be the most aware because players are just going to land right near your box all the time. The only time I like to be center zone is when I know that I have to grab a refresh. In the center, this is where I know that a lot of players are going to be, so my chances of grabbing something is pretty dang high. Sometimes when I rotate in an endgame, I'll land above someone like this and then turn around and try and box fight them from the top to grab a refresh. As I land, I look to place 2 floors, one underneath their cone, and then try and quickly take the cone above their box and then get the kill. You do it quick and it will work a lot. Here's a few kind of solo tarps that I would practice. These are the easier ones, stuff that's pretty easy that I would use in an endgame. This is what that looks like. This tip is a more advanced version. These tarps are a bit more complicated, but you can see that they're still pretty useful, and there's even some other, I got some clips of some other pros using this exact one. It's kind of like advanced solo tarps, but to be honest, I would still even use these and do duos or trios. If you start getting shot at on a mid-ground layer, just full tarp the whole thing if you need to. Either that or you're going to stop and pause and then wait to go when the pressure gets off you a little bit. Just remember to not die with mats. In these zones, using them is totally fine. No matter what the mode is, when you create a tarp, you want to block your back every 3 to 4-ish boxes. Never have a full tarp where someone can see you at the front when they're all the way in the back. You're going to die a ton in Fortnite if that's the case. Okay, so when you have hard 0 mats in the game, you have one of 2 options, generally speaking. You're either going to one rat in someone's tarp, break in and just try and just sneak in, maybe grab a refresh that way. Or what you're going to do is you're going to rat on the edge of builds or like the edge of zone and try and pick something up on the edge of the circle. The most shambles players are going to be on the back side of the map. So even when you kill someone, you're going to grab that siphon and it will take you so far. So when you have mats, you want to avoid the back side of the zone. So when you're on the edge, the center of it is the most grief thing ever. If you have mats, this is just not the look to be back here. So when you're forced to play on a mid layer in a game, you play it by ear, of course, but I guess a general rule of thumb would not be the very last to rotate. The hammer meta, which we were also fond of, if you waited the very last second, you would just hammer into someone's tarp and not go to the front of the zone. That's why it paid to go a little early in that meta. That way you have a freer rotate. Typically, I would say beginner players think they need to tarp the entire zone and just get refreshes along the way every second. An end game is a nice flow of tarping ahead, looking back, grabbing a refresh, then running, tarping, and then looking back, grabbing a refresh. It's kind of a stop, go, and you don't always need to be full tarping the entire thing. If you do manage to find yourself on the back side of a zone, what you're going to do is you're going to tarp out of it and then maybe look for a sprint. It's very rare that you're going to see someone just running out of the back side of zone when they have mats, because 9 times out of 10 there's going to be someone looking back there looking to just get some kills. Let's say you're rotating with any movement item, impulses, hammer, whatever it is. Try to stick to one side of the zone, left or right. I would definitely avoid trying to go through the center of everything. That's what you want to look for, but it doesn't always go down like that. That's a perfect scenario. So you know a player has nothing, like I said in a different tip, when they're on top of your builds. One thing I was taught by coaches is that, yeah, you can try and go for the kill, but the safer play is to just ramp up and go for the height. Then you can look down and try and grab a kill. So one thing a pro taught me was that as I was to stop moving and I'm like creating that box to get into the zone, I'm instantly and already developing a plan for what I'm going to do the next rotate. So whenever it comes time to move again, I always have a plan to what I need to do. Pretty much always trying to stay one step ahead so that way I don't get an impulse decision being made last second. If you're rotating with a launch pad and there's players that are well developed on height, just low pad the thing. Low padding in late zones is almost the play every single time if they're in the game. You'll know what I mean for the people that die by it. If you high pad in a late game, you're probably dying out the air. Going off that, even before the moving zones are happening, the time to rotate is when you hear other people rotating. When I play the game, usually I try to never be the first person to act. The second, third, or even fourth is the most ideal. If you have a refresh opportunity, or let's just say you're looking for one, be mindful of the people around you before you go to fight. The most common time that someone will sneak into your box is when they realize that you're focused on something else. The second they hear you shooting or spraying at something else, that's when they're going to start breaking in, because it's the least likely time they're going to be heard. This right here is a really pro move. So in endgame, what I've seen good players do, they look below, above, or in front of them to see which walls recently got reset. The second that happens, they go in and they pickaxe clean and smooth in, and they get right in your face for a quick kill. If you're on low ground or whatever ground, you're just looking at someone ahead of you, it could definitely be worth to try and block your angles, sort of create a box outside the box you're shooting from, so that way your head can't get jumped pretty easy. So if you have tons of white heals, splashes, flops, you're in a super congested area, stay calm, use those whites in the zone, make a storm play to scout a path, so that way you're not just mindlessly tarping into other people or just running in the open with no builds. When you're tarping on full low ground, look to cut off other teams on that layer, tarp ahead of them, block them off, so that way you can try and bully them off and make them do something else, just get them away from your space. When you can control the low ground like that, that's how you win the game. So if you're new to the game, you're going to think, I need to grab a refresh, let me look back behind me. What I've learned from players over the years is that you can look ahead of you, and if you crack someone ahead of you, you can use a few builds, tarp over, and then just get in their box. This is the best way to try and grab refreshes, because now you're ahead of the zone and you have more mats. It's a win-win. So if you're getting low on mats and you're in the moving zones, there's always going to be random builds all over the place. I mean, you're just looking and you're going to see all these builds. If there's ever a stair or a weak wall, this is the the best time to exploit in. This could be some of the freest kills for you, and it happens to me pretty much all the time. So when you get cracked with a lot of mats in the end game, you always need to make sure that you're healing in 2 boxes and not just 1. I didn't do it right here until my coach reminded me to do so, and then that's when I created another box. Now I'm way more safe in this. It should have been my instant reaction to try and do this because it just discourages people from spraying at you. In duos especially, what teams look to do when they don't have a lot of mats, they look to get in on wood tarps. So if a wood wall is fully healthy, they both swing their pickaxe at the same time and they have more of an advantage to try and get some quick shots than just trying to take it safely 1 box away. Those slight things of jumping in, kind of scaring the other team in the box, that's what can kill them and take them off guard. So when I land in my own box, I kind of create a little tarp, right? I look to pay attention to who lands diagonally from me, like on my tarp, and I take their bottoms 1 piece at a time. So we replace their floor, and then I try and shoot the cone and try and turn that into a stair so they just drop down right in my box. The faster you do it when they land, the more they're not going to be ready for it. So usually I would say, I mean, at least in my situations, you're going to count on people to just make crappy edits in the end game. If you're completely cornered, you have nowhere to go, the guy has the wall in front of you, just sit there with your shotgun now, because chances are they're not going to make an optimal edit. In a top 5 situation, I don't think the first thing they're thinking about is how can I make this edit the most optimal. They just think you're weak and they're going to kill you with 1 shot. The best places to be in an end game is either front side, low ground, or high ground. So when it comes to the final zones, you really don't want to be the middle ground team because you're going to get pressured from both above you and below you. So try to make a play on the spot that's going to win you the game. When you're on front side, low ground, you need to be heavily scouting the terrain around you. You need to be prepared to move up a couple boxes or go down even more. But if it does pull up a heavy mountain, you want to try your best not to get buried. So the earlier you do that, the better. So when I'm in an end game and I see it pulls literally vertically up a mountain that I can't tarp up, the easiest thing to do to like try and get yourself above that mountain is to go to the left or right side of all the congestion. Sometimes you're going to have to tank zone for it, but it's definitely the play because it's where the least amount of players are. Speaking of, you should definitely learn how to tarp vertically up in full speed because if you need to move up layers quickly, this is going to be the safest way to do it. So when I got my game reviewed by a pro, his name was Jamper, he told me that I was carrying too much shields into my end game. If you get a refresh and they drop all these heals and you don't know what to choose, you want to pick up as much whites as possible. Ideally, you just want to use splash and floppers. The floppers are for your white health and the splash is for your blue. It's a complete game changer because anything you can do to give yourself more time in zone is going to help you win the game. So let's just use this as an example. You land on the low ground and you think you're going to get buried. Quickly just create a top box like this in hard mats. This is the best way to gain vertical space, which is super important in the end game and it makes it rotate easier. The next tip is to gain vertical space as much as possible. One way pros do it all the time is whenever they create a box, they just jump in their cone and they're gaining vertical space that way. Even going up just 1 layer in your own box is a really good way to get elevated for the next zone. Naturally, in end games, you never want to drop fully low ground until the later zones. It's so much easier, especially in solos, if you kind of use other people's builds to cheap tarp around and just stay elevated. When you get cracked and then you go to box up in an end game, when you have the full box made, don't pop your heals right away. Give yourself 1 to 2 seconds after the box has been created so that you can give yourself some assurances that no one else is going to spray you. Then you can pop your heals in peace. Right after you land, that's the most likely time you're going to get sprayed at. If you wait a second, it's going to be less likely. That pause will save a life. Even in general, if you don't get cracked, you create a fresh box. Always hold your walls, flip your cone for protection. That way you can't get jumped in on at any given moment. Players all the time, they play super cautious, super safe, just in case, and then that will help them win the game. So if you use a pad, any sort of rotation, some sort of perk, whatever, it's better to try and land safe than land deeper into the zone. Landing further back away from the hot spot of where everyone else is going, it makes you have to rotate again, but at least you're safe enough to the point where you're not going to 50-50 anyone. Players all the time, they're looking to save hard mats. So one thing I do in particular, and a lot of other players, they build a box in hard mats, but then they build the cone in wood. That one metal or brick build, it could absolutely be the difference maker in the final moments of the game. If I'm absolutely max mats, I try to save my metal for the final zones, but I always use a little bit of each mat throughout the moving zones so that way you got to think about it. When I grab a refresh off a body, I can get cap mats back. If I had full brick in that fight and that guy only had brick, then I don't gain anything. But because I used a little bit of each, no matter what, when I get a kill, I'll get max materials back. So if you're an advanced tarper, what you're going to do is you're going to build a little in hard mats. And then as you continue and you realize that no one's spraying at you, you could quickly switch to wood and try and throw in a quick little cheap box in there and then build the rest in hard mats. This prolongs the life of all the hard materials you got so that you can save them for later. Only advanced tarpers are going to do that. So one thing Cease taught me was to always triple edit your cone in the direction of the biggest threat. This is something I do when I really want to play safe and cautious, and that definitely doesn't hurt to throw that in there. When you're in the heat of an endgame and you create a box, quickly turn and make sure all the walls are yours before you do something else. You'll be surprised how many times by just turning around, looking at your walls will actually save you. I get caught lacking a ton and I just got to be more hyper aware. When I know I got a lot of mats, I'm not looking for 50-50 plays. So if a player with no mats tries to run into my box like this guy, I hold him out and I play it very slow and I don't go for any baits. Like right here, I know if I reset this cone, this guy gets first shot. If he breaks it with his pickaxe, I get first shot. So I just play slow and I don't rush. Anytime you tarp in wood, you need to be hyper aware of the sounds around you. In a tarp like this is when you're most likely to get psychoed on. Chances are you never ever want to go into a valley in some sort of endgame. You're pretty much asking for death every time because if the zone pulls up the thing again, you're gonna have to just burn so much more mats. If you can avoid it, definitely do so. In the late game, if I make a window edit, I never like to touch the wall as I'm looking out. See how I'm sitting further back right here? Even this much space will give me more time to react when someone jumps at me. I can't tell you how many times this has saved my life. If you have spare whites, you can use them in zone like we talked about in this video, but you can go to grab mats with those whites. The reason why I like having so much whites is because you can use them to grab not only other positions, but just mats in the zone. A few builds in the last 1v1 is going to be a huge difference maker when it comes down to it. The absolute final tip is to use code KenBeans in the shop. I'm telling you, this is the best way to support. Also, check out my other two channels down below in the description. I hope you learned a thing or two about endgames. If you're a beginner, this is definitely a thing that you probably want to watch more than once because there are some high level tips in here. This has been your man Ken, and honestly, my voice is shot. Hope this video isn't too long for you. See you later. Peace.